Welcome, everybody. By way of introduction, my name is Julie Law, and I'm the Chief People Officer for Rocket Software. Before we get into this, for making our strong community stronger and fostering inclusive work environments for the LGBTQIA plus community, wanted to give you a quick housekeeping rules. So this webinar is being recorded. It will be posted on the Open Mainframe Project YouTube channel in the Making Our Strong Community Stronger playlist. Questions and comments can be asked in the Q&A or chat. And please connect with us on LinkedIn, Making the Strong Community Stronger LinkedIn page after, and you'll see this actually in the chat feature as well. So as I mentioned, I'm Julie Law. I am the Chief People Officer for Rocket Software, and we are thrilled today to be a sponsor of Making Strong Communities Stronger. Diversity, equity, inclusion is a critical element for Rocket's success, and we're really glad as a community we can come together for events like today to support inclusion and belonging across the industry. For those who don't know Rocket Software, we have approximately 2,600 colleagues from around the globe, and our core values are empathy, humanity, trust, and love, which is quite novel for a software company. We also believe it's not just what we do, but how we do it. And this is why today's session is critically important for us as an organization and for our community. Rocket as a business partners with the largest enterprises in all industries to solve their most complex IT challenges across infrastructure, data, and applications. Our solutions are designed to simplify, not disrupt our customers' modernization journey. So we have a modernization in place to help our customers move to a hybrid cloud strategy so they don't need to build from the ground up. We have an awesome panel of leaders today to share perspectives, and I'm now excited to introduce you to Jess Pettitt, who's our moderator for this discussion. Jess has spent the last 20 years being a recognized leader and facilitator and educator in the diversity and inclusion space. The past decade, she's focused on coaching and teaching and motivating thousands of people across the world to build understanding and to drive ownership of diversity, equity, and inclusion globally. And what I particularly love about Jess, not only how colorful she is, but she uses humor and straight talk to cultivate the space to eliminate fear and pass learnings to one another. She's not afraid to ask tough questions and build a trusting environment to foster belonging and psychological safety. And with that, with trust being the theme and Rocket's core value, I turn it over to Jess to lead us through the discussion today.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Julie, for your support. And I am super excited to get to this really amazing panel. So today, again, with this webinar is being recorded, and I want to give you a texting number. So those of you that are watching the recording, you can still text and ask questions, and I'm happy to get back to you with any resources or answers. Those of you that are here live today, hi, you are also welcome to text questions now or later. The texting number is 202-670-4262, and I'll put it in the chat in just a second. So as we get ready to talk to our panel about a conversation that matters, specifically regarding LGBTQIA+, I want to first kind of explain what those letters might mean. For some of us, we may know this, and others we may not. Some of the letters also mean more than one thing, and there's other letters that might not be represented. And we're going to use LGBTQIA+ as an umbrella term. We can get into the history specific of the order and how the letters came about. Feel free to text me if you have any questions. But we're going to be talking about lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer or questioning, intersex, as well as asexual or ally work, and identities and expression in the workplace. And the plus is ideally for people who don't identify specific to those words, but do feel part of this community as well. So with that, how this is going to work is you're going to be able to use the Q&A function in Zoom, the chat function in Zoom, or you can text message me directly at 202-670-4262. Any questions that you have for me or our amazing panelists. But to get things started, because you didn't come here to listen to me, what I really would like to do is get things started with our panel. And so each of our panelists is going to introduce themselves and then answer kind of a key question that came up in our one-on-one conversations as we were prepping for this panel discussion today. So first up, we have Dan Brown. So I had an amazing one-on-one conversation with him. Hi, Dan. So what I'm going to do is let Dan kind of introduce himself. But Dan, really the takeaway from our one-on-one conversation that I'd love for you to kind of word cloud chat about is about the internal and external resources, best practices, diversifying recruitment. What does that impact retention? We had a great conversation and it was all over the place. But you get to talk about anything you want to related to LGBTQIA plus employees, how they're hired, promoted, and supported in the workplace. And with that, Dan, please introduce yourself. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jess. I'm really happy to be here. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Dan Brown. I work at the Linux Foundation. Specifically, I work at a project called LF Energy, which is focused on building open source solutions to decarbonize power systems. I've been in the technology, communications, and marketing space for about 20 years. Prior to joining LF Energy last year, I had actually overseen communications activities for Linux Foundation training and certification, which is really striving to make it easier for folks to join the open source community as a developer or other community member. And so a large part of that was outreach to underrepresented communities, including the LGBTQIA plus community. And so I have, looked into a lot of research and that sort of thing, as Jess alluded to, about what sort of practices and activities organizations can undertake to make themselves more welcoming and inclusive to members of the community. So I'm really excited to talk about that today with all of you. Jess, did you want me to answer that question right now?
Absolutely, go for it.
Okay, and we could spend an entire hour just on this particular topic, but I will point out just a few things to keep in mind. And I would actually encourage folks to check out Linux Foundation research. We have a really good diversity, equity, and inclusion report that goes into a lot more specific practices and suggestions that both companies as well as open source communities can implement to be more welcoming to the community. But the sorts of things that you want to look at are keeping in mind that our community doesn't always have traditional family structures. There's this concept of chosen family. A lot of folks in the LGBTQIA community don't have relationships with their biological families. And so when you're doing things like setting family leave policies, you want to keep that in mind and be open to folks who may need time off for something that isn't, related to, say, a parent or a child or a spouse. It may be broader than that. So that's just one tip. Another is thinking about employee resource groups, creating a space within your organization for the community to gather and discuss how your organization is doing and what more they could be doing to improve relations with those employees. And it's not just giving a space for social activities and that sort of thing. That's part of it. But you actually want buy-in from management and HR and the ability to give feedback and have that feedback taken seriously. Just one more tip, I would say, look at codes of conduct. These are very common in open source communities, but they can be applied in any sort of organization. That can kind of be a non-discrimination policy, but it can also go beyond that. And it's just about people treating each other fairly and in a friendly manner. So definitely review some of those resources. In terms of resources, in addition to that Linux Foundation research report I mentioned, I would also point to SHRM, the Society of Human Resource Managers. They have a great toolkit for creating LGBTQIA inclusive environments, and also the Human Rights Campaign. They have an entire section of resources on their website, hrc.org, all about workplace inclusivity for this community. With that, I will turn it back to Jess and to our other great panelists.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dan. And I'm going to ask you if you can also put some of those websites that you recommended into the chat while Michelle is up. That would be great.
Absolutely.
So, and obviously you're talking about things that are massive, and each one of these people could easily talk for an hour. And with that, we're just trying to kind of like get people kind of going with what kind of questions they might have. So I can't wait to also introduce now Michelle Hébert, a bear in the forest. Did I say it right?
Hébert. Yes.
Hébert, close, a bear in the forest. Okay, great. So what Michelle and I also had a pre-conversation, and one of the things that I think makes people a little nervous right now about some of the conversations related to LGBTQIA came up in our conversation. And so, Michelle, what I'm going to ask you to kind of touch on your word cloud, that could be its own webinar as well, is that as a married pansexual woman living in Florida, whoa, can we share a little bit about what the intersectionality of not just your lived experiences, but how our lived experiences are both connected to community, but also still leave lots of room for learning. So with that, Michelle, I'm going to turn my video off and you're up. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And thank you, Jess. Wow. Michelle Hébert. I am an enablement manager with Applied Systems. We are a global insurance technology partner. I also serve as our company's co-chair for the Pride at Applied Community of Interest, in addition to being a Global Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Council co-chair for our customer experience business unit. So I live in Northeast Florida on the beach, not on the beach, but in the beach community with my spouse, Colleen, of 19 years. We recently transplanted from Connecticut, and it's certainly a different experience being down here. And we were nervous coming down because, you know, you never know how people are going to greet you or anything like that. But we tend to just kind of live our lives, and people just come to know us, and it winds up being fantastic. And people who may not have been as open-minded become a little more open-minded, we find. And I really think a lot of that has to do with how we approach the people around us and taking opportunities to educate. We have multiple communities of interest at Applied Systems, and we look for opportunities to highlight certain people during, all through the year, where we're crossing the different communities of interest, because the marginalization becomes compounded, right? It's one thing to be a woman in technology where you're not very much, you're like the only one, right? But then when you add to that you're married to a woman, and people are saying, oh, what does your husband do? Well, I don't really have a husband. So I think finding the ways to have those gentle conversations with people is always beneficial. I take every possible moment as a learning and teaching moment, instead of, don't judge me. It's, well, actually, here's some information about that. I find that people tend to open up and ask me more because they genuinely care. And what we find is, or what I have found, at least in my experience, is that judgment is based more in naivete and not knowing or understanding what it is that we're judging or talking about. So by learning and asking genuine questions with an open heart and an open mind, those who aren't in the LGBTQIA plus community can learn and can understand that we are pretty much no different than you for the most part. We face challenges, but I think most people face challenges every day. But understanding that just giving us an opportunity to be ourselves and bring our authentic self to work and do what we do best, our jobs, right? Then we find a different experience. So what do you think, Jess?
I couldn't agree more. I think that my big takeaway from what you said was when marginalization becomes compounded. how that can change based on industry, location, as your own relationship changes. Dan also talked a little bit about that we can have complicated families. I just thought that was great. Anything else before we hand it back over to Larry?
I don't think so. I'm good for now, but thank
Excellent.
you.
Well, wait for the questions to come in. And again, y'all can text message me at 202-670-4262. But while we're waiting on that, we are going to bring in Larry Cook. So Larry and I, you may be noticing, also had an amazing conversation to get started, not to mention some fabulous shirt links. But Larry, when you and I were talking, we realized this webinar could go all over the place. And so what I'm going to invite you to share a little bit about is the conversation that's happening now around kind of the moral argument. And I married a philosopher, so I do not believe in moral relativism. But can you talk a little bit or kind of reference the word cloud that we talked about the moral argument regarding gender and sexuality, but really also the business case that is being made across multiple different industries for inclusion and how that actually works within your corporate role as an employee, as a supervisor, etc. So is that a good enough word cloud for you?
That's great. But so first, I'm Larry Cook. I'm a global events manager for Broadcom's Mainframe software division. I'm delighted to be here. I've had almost 40 years working in a variety of marketing positions, both technology companies, as well as on the agency side. So I'll get to your point, but I kind of want to build first on what Michelle was saying, because I think it's really important. And as the elder statesperson here, I've been reflecting on how things have changed since I began my first professional job, as my dad would say, your real job, out of grad school back in 1984. You know, I feel like Sophia Petrillo on the Golden Girls. You know, picture this, Sicily, 1922, for those of you old enough to remember the Golden Girls. Now, I've been lucky. I've always worked in a white collar kind of environment, what I would call white collar. And I've lived in metropolitan areas, and I've been in organizations where I've never really felt or encountered a lot of what I would say discriminatory practices. But I know that's not always the case, particularly for people that have worked in different environments or perhaps in different cities. But even though that's the case, I have to say that many of my friends and colleagues back when I started out were afraid to come out. And to a certain extent, that hasn't changed a lot over all this time. There are many people that are afraid to come out in the workplace. They're afraid to come out and not live their authentic self. And I think this is really unfortunate. There's a lot of studies out there that will talk about the productivity and the employee satisfaction that goes up when people feel like they don't have to hide their authentic self. So one thing I would say, and I would encourage all of the managers and all of the employers out there, encourage your employees to be their authentic self. It doesn't mean that everyone has to come screaming out of the closet. Everybody's going to do what makes themselves comfortable, but be sure that you have an environment that people feel comfortable in order to do that, where they can put a picture of their spouse or their extended family, as Dan said, on their desk. So just keep that in mind, and I think you're going to find that you've got a much happier workplace. Now, Jess, going back to your point, on the topic of diversity initiatives, there's been a lot of discussion going on these days around that. Now, in 1999, I was employed by IBM, and IBM actually held a meeting of about 400 gay and lesbian employees. They brought them together from around the globe to discuss the challenges that as employees they were feeling and how IBM could do a better job in addressing gay and lesbian issues within the workplace. It's probably one of the most fascinating and worthwhile times that I spent, 3 or 4 days. Now, Ted Childs, who was head of global diversity programs at IBM, and he also reported into George Bush in the White House on diversity issues. He addressed this, and in no uncertain terms, he mentioned in language that I won't share with you today, that the notion of diversity programs, the idea that these were a moral imperative, is actually incorrect. They are a business imperative. We are employed, and these are his words and tempered down, we're employed to make our company money. And if our customers feel that you're uncomfortable dealing with them, then they'll take their business elsewhere. And he said, if you disagree with this, then hit the door, go elsewhere. And I think that's still very relevant conversation today, even more so when diversity initiatives are under fire in certain cities, states, and countries. So keep that in mind, because I think it's important, because a lot of people think, oh, we're doing this because it's a nice thing to do. No, we're doing it because it's the smart thing to do. So Jess, I'll turn it back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I feel like in my consulting work, I'm always being kind of pickleballed between the moral argument and the business argument. And what I think is important is that alone, neither of them gets a lot of attention, but it is possibly the weaving together of both of them that might get us to some kind of new place. So thank you so much, Larry, for kind of leading that way for so many. I really, really appreciate it. So next up, we have our last panelist. And then again, those of you watching the recording and those of you live, I would like to invite you to text message any questions or comments that you have so that we can feed them out to the panelists. Feel free to do that. The number again is 202-670-4262. And with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite Deborah, I'm going to say this, Schildkraut. Did I get it right?
Perfect.
Good job. It's early in the morning. I'm half a cup of coffee in. I want to be respectful. So Debbie, we also had, of course, an amazing conversation. People are probably noticing the pattern by now. I'm so excited for you and your perspective to be part of this panel as well, to inspire as many comments or questions that we can get, because what we really talked about, one, is the tumultuous workforce that's happening right now, but also this concept, and maybe this is even a thread back to what Larry was talking about of the moral and the business case, but bringing our whole selves to work is a big ask for some people and is a completely unnoticed entitlement to others. So when we bring our whole selves to work, can you talk a little bit, as we did in our conversation, about LGBTQI family members, community members, maybe not you, but how that connects to ally advocacy and accomplice-based work that are happening in our personal lives, and how we're supportive of that inside of a workplace setting?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jess. And I'm so thrilled to be here on this amazing panel and to share some thoughts and ideas, to hopefully inspire others to try some new approaches, which is something that I did. But first, let's do a quick intro on who I am. I'm Debbie Kestin Schildkraut. I'm president of Kestin Impact Consulting, which is my own business, obviously, supporting clients in channel strategy, ecosystem marketing, events, and especially around community building. I previously worked in the advertising agency world. I then spent the bulk of my career at IBM, and Larry is an amazing former coworker of mine, so thrilled to be on this panel together with him again. I was in a variety of exciting roles at IBM, and most recently served as VP of Global Community Engagement for an IT industry association. And I've long been an advocate, spokesperson, panelist, an active implementer for advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging initiatives, especially in the work environment. So to answer Jess's question, when we think about, and to build upon what Larry said, when we think about employees and how they have to come to work every day, if you think about it, we're all actors, right? We show up at work, we do our jobs, we put on a brave face, no matter what might be going on in our personal worlds. And things could be chaotic, but you always you're just trying to show up and be there. And sometimes people start to have cracks and breaks, and they might get increasingly sensitive at work if somebody snaps at them, or they may start to show signs of stress and sensitivity. And generally people will just be like, what's wrong with that person? And they won't stop to give them any leeway. They won't stop to think about giving them a little space or empathy or finding out what's going on. And this could be going on for anybody, whether they're in the LGBT community or any individual. So I want this conversation to be about whoever you are listening. We all have our personal lives that are part of who we are when we come to work every day. So in tapping into that a little bit, when I was at IBM, I started an LGBTQ+ families community group. And it started out when I met another parent who had a non-binary child, and the family and the child were going through a very difficult time. And even with the most supportive families, when someone comes out or there's changes that just start to surface, this can be confusing for people. There's adjustments to everyday things like pronouns, or, a name change, or clarifying and explaining to others about an update in identity, as an example. So I started this group as a support group, so there'd be a safe place for people at work to have an outlet to ask questions, to share situations, to find resources. And it was initially geared a little bit more towards just like family members with other family members, that they wanted to support better and to learn more and understand better. But this evolved. This initiative was so incredibly powerful that people in the LGBT community joined us, seeing it as a supportive parental group where they may not have that where they live, or, with their own families. And somebody earlier in the conversations here mentioned having chosen families. And we became a chosen family. It was a very emotional, powerful, wonderful experience. Probably one of the best things that I was ever involved with, in my life. And I had individuals who privately reached out and set up calls with me to come out, and that they feared letting anybody at work know that about them. And I'm sitting here thinking, this is 2023, or in that case 2021. People should just be accepting of whoever anybody is at this point. It was kind of mind-boggling in some ways to think about the fact that we still have to talk about this, but we do, right? It's just the world as it is. So what was really important about that is that we had people in the LGBT community join the parents group or the family group to share different kinds of experiences, stories, perspectives, help people to understand things on a more deeper level. And it was, I could tell you story after story, but I don't want to take up the whole webinar here. So I'm happy to share some of that, in Q&A portion. But I think it's really important that that individuals think about other individuals and not be judgmental, to think about how much weight can be on somebody's shoulders when they're walking around all day, all of the time, trying, to hide who they are and just be themselves, just be, right? Just be who you are. So happily at IBM, as I mentioned, and other companies I'm loving to see some of the initiatives that are taking place. IBM had out executives where people could, and that was an outgrowth of what Larry talked about, where people had a safe community as well to go to say, how did you do this? Or how did you deal with this situation of maybe an unconscious bias, comment or things like that. And again, I love what Michelle said, and to build upon what she said, is teachable moments are really a wonderful way to just explain to people don't get defensive, but just explaining to people about what something means or what it's all about. What does non-binary mean? Why do people use pronouns? And just explaining what that's all about. And using pronouns is really all about letting us all know that it's all a comfortable thing, and then you don't have to wonder or question. And it's just an open way to share how someone identifies. And it's really important. So companies really need to think about ways that they can create a culture and space where people don't have to worry about how they show up. So, whether you're an LGBTQ, person or an ally, we are all just people. So how do we create those environments of just open acceptance without judgment? The emergence of ERGs, which are employee resource groups, some people call them BRGs, business resource groups, are a huge step towards support, but they're not the only things that companies can do. But if you regardless of your company size, if you haven't started an employee resource group for Pride or for advancing women or for any of those kinds of groups, it's really important to start. It's a good way to just start, I'd say, as a first step. And before I pass it back to Jess, I just want to acknowledge one other thing. Today happens to be the International Day against homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, and discrimination against intersex people. And yes, there's things on the calendars that help us take a moment. So it's really fitting that we've had this panel set up for today. But anybody that's listening, you can all increase your allyship into everyday acts by being supportive, by standing up for somebody else, by not just being a bystander if somebody's being inappropriate to somebody else. And you could also, put your pronouns out there like we have on the Zoom here. And it's just, again, politely correcting or educating somebody in a situation when you see it. So anyway, I just want to thank everybody for allowing me the time to be here and to share some of my thoughts. And I'm going to turn it back over to Jess, and hopefully we've got lots of questions we can answer for all of you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We do have a couple of questions, and I'm going to invite all the panelists to turn their cameras back on so that we can all be kind of together. And then, let's see, Deborah, I'm going to unspotlight Deborah so that we can all kind of show up. Here we are. When some of the text messages that came in, I'm kind of sorting them out, and I'll be assigning them to individual panelists as well. But first off, I just want to thank Larry, Michelle, Debbie, Dan for kind of lobbing out some starting places of some conversations. But first, what I want to do is I want to be able to see if, Dan, we'll go back to you since you kicked off the panel. Do you have any thoughts or comments or anything about that when you kind of started us off broadly with resources, specifically in listening to Larry, Michelle, or Debbie? Did come up with anything that you want to share?
Yeah, I really liked a couple of the things that I heard from everyone, but it seemed one of the themes was a little bit around difficulties around coming out in the workplace. And, all of us in the community have experienced, confusion, uncertainty, difficulty with how to do that in the first place. And I actually have an anecdote I can share from a previous life, a previous job. I had just started at this company. I was in the Bay Area office, but we were based in Atlanta, and so it was a very small office. And as I was meeting my new colleagues, just somewhere in conversation, I dropped in that I had a boyfriend. This was before my husband and I were married. And a couple days later, I was meeting with one of those new colleagues, and he shut the office door and said, "I have something to tell you." And I was like, "Oh, what is it?" And he's like, "I'm gay, but I just don't know how to do that, how to tell everyone here in the office that it's, really nerve-wracking for me." And I'm going, this was 2012, I think. And so to me, I had been privileged enough not to experience any overly negative reactions in my life. And so I never made it a big deal, rather than, do some big announcement or kind of go into people's faces about it. I just slip it into conversation. And he was like, "I've never seen that before." He was like, "I've worked here for a couple of years now, and I don't know how to do that now." Because people just assume. One of the coworkers was actually trying to set him up with a woman, a friend of hers. And so, I unfortunately at that time didn't feel like I had great advice for him. I was like, my best advice is don't make a big deal of it. But, if you want folks to know, then you need to let them know. So, you have to kind of take it on yourself. And it's unfair in some ways that we have to go through these experiences and have to do that, because obviously straight people don't need to come out all the time. It's just assumed as the default. And so I would just, encourage those on this call to think about the fact that you may have coworkers who are in that same situation. And so what can you do to make it more comfortable for them to tell you about their life? As Deborah said, to just be, because it's not always easy for us. And so, we should be careful not to make those assumptions and to just, find ways to make it clear that you are an ally and that you're accepting and that you're not going to treat someone differently because of this one piece of who they are. But at the same time, they shouldn't need to hide it.
And Dan, I appreciate you kind of flipping the rhetoric a little bit about like, what can I do to make the place more comfortable? And Deborah, it kind of, to me, connects back, and then Michelle will go to you with your question. But when Deborah was talking about don't be defensive, that I often talk to people that when you are interacting with someone who is not responding the way you would like for them to, you can't make them respond differently. But what you can do is use that as a moment of like, wait a minute, when have I responded this way? When do I make people feel the way I am feeling right now? And then use that experience for good so that you don't make other people feel the way you are currently feeling. That was not a ghost, that was a dog. And so there's a combination between asking yourself, what can I do to create a space that is inclusive of people who may not realize that they can talk? And that inevitably is creating the space where you can then also show up. And that's how you kind of deflate some of those defensive tendencies, not necessarily in others, but at least in yourself. So I want to make sure I connect those two dots. So Michelle, you and I were prepping because we got a text message and I gave it to you. Good job. And that is, the question was, how do you broach the conversation of sharing your authentic self with managers and or colleagues who have not explicitly made it clear that they support LGBTQIA folks? So Michelle, I know you had an answer to that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because my answer, what I was thinking at the moment, has just kind of broadened based on what I'm hearing here. And I'm going to tell a really quick little story about when my spouse and I met and we were getting married. And she had been for years brought to Thanksgiving dinners with some nice gentleman to meet, right? And had no interest, but the family kept trying. And then when we're going to get married, she didn't want to send the wedding invitations out. She was scared because basically it was a coming out. And a good family member said to her, how dare you judge your family that they won't accept you? You have no right. You send those damned invitations and you let them decide. We had everybody come to our destination wedding. It was crazy. The acceptance was incredible. So I guess where I will go with this is try not to judge the people around you, right? So if we're afraid, we're judging them. We're assuming that they're not going to accept us. And that's judging them as being a not good person, I guess, in my mind, right? If I can say that. So I tend to say, oh, my spouse Colleen works in cancer protocols, and she, so bringing it into a relative conversation where somebody's talking about something, or people are talking about their kids. Oh, yeah, Colleen and I had to split up, the parent duty of one of us taking oranges to one soccer game and the other had to take gallons of water to the other. And then we meet up for McDonald's after, you know what I mean? Things like that. So where you just let people know that you're real, that you're relative and belong, that you belong. If you assume you don't belong, you're going to act like you don't belong, right? So you have a right to be there. You are hired, especially in the workplace, you're hired for what you bring to the table. What you do when you walk out the door doesn't change what you're bringing to the table, right? So I encourage everybody not to assume that you're going to be judged or disliked. The expectation should be that you're accepted for who you are. I tend to be someone who doesn't wave things in people's faces, but On the other hand, I take those teaching moment advantages too. People, once they find out, they try to be really inclusive, and they'll say, oh, your wife just told me. And I'm like, wait a minute, I don't have a wife. There's only room for one wife in this relationship, and that's me. And they're like, oh, you don't call Colleen your wife? I said, no, I say spouse. I said, Colleen's not, the wifely type. And Colleen certainly doesn't identify as my wife. She's more non-binary in how she presents herself. So she does use she, her pronouns usually, but it's I try not to make assumptions, and I try to take those moments to educate people, but try to bring a little bit of levity to it instead of saying she's not my wife, because I've done that in the past, and I'm like, wait a minute, why am I judging them and why am I being a jerk? Give them the opportunity to understand why Colleen is not my wife. So take advantage of that and really just be yourself and be present and real. Don't make assumptions on how they're going to feel.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michelle, for sharing. And Larry, it looked like you wanted to weigh in on that too. Do you want in?
Sure. Are you moving me to the stage?
We're all sharing the stage.
Oh, okay.
Just gonna
I'm
have
ready
to
for
get
my
used to
close-up,
it.
Mr. DeMille. One of the things that the two things that hit home, I had the same situation when I got married, Michelle, is my husband's family are very they're very conservative. And so it was like Clint, my husband, he goes, well, I'm gonna invite my family. I don't think they're gonna come. Well, by God, they all came. Right. And so again, never assume, because you know what they say about assumptions, what somebody's going to do. The other thing, though, that I to this question that I thought was really interesting is the way it was posed is it becomes your problem. It's your problem when you feel like they're not accepting you. The reality is, take the monkey off your back, right? It's their issue. You be who you are, and they're the ones that have to deal with it. Now, and I would say probably the bulk of the time, there isn't an issue. It may be something they're not comfortable with dealing with, or it may be something that they've just never said because they didn't think it was an important issue. So, I don't make an issue out of something that's not there.
Mm-hmm. Great advice.
I wanted to just add to that, it's interesting, in this LGBTQ plus families group that I led, culturally, globally, there's still countries and cultures that just can't get their heads around this, sadly. And we had one gentleman who spoke on one of my support group calls. He was pretty much an only child. His father left his mom and him when he was very small. And when he came out to his mother, she basically stopped talking to him. It was very painful. And, what he said was that, like, he was so hurt, but because, it's your parent, like, as a parent, like my kids, are my core, so like, it's so hard for me to like think that this mother would just not talk to their child, right? But that's what she did. That's how she reacted. Part of it was fear. Part of it was misunderstanding, however you want to look at it. But this individual, he said, you know what? He goes, I just decided that one day I was going to be the grown-up in the room and go back to my mom and just basically say, hey, look, I love you. The fact that you've cut me out of your life hurts me. This is my partner. I love him. He's a very capable, professional in what he does. He treats me well, and he made just all the points back to his mom. And it helped flip the relationship back to be open again, which thank God that's what the outcome was. And I would hope that anybody that does that has that. But I was just like so proud and happy that this gentleman, said like, you know what, I instead of just letting it be, right? Sometimes people just leave the anger there, whether it's in families or at work, it's hard, but like the fact that he went back And I had him speak on my call because I wanted other parents to hear. Like, I don't know how everybody handles their situations. I know how I do. You know, I'm supportive of my kids no matter, you know, what, and, you know, be an educational moment or whatever. But, you know, that it's okay to go fix things, you know, and not just leave them broken. And the fact that he went back and educated her, I wanted other parents to hear that maybe they could be the bigger person if that was what happened with their student, I mean, with their child, and go back and maybe they could go and, you know, extend that olive branch and say, you know what, I overreacted, I reacted wrong, I acted out of fear. You know, and I think managers, you know, and peers can do the same. You know, if you've done something or acted inappropriately or impulsively to somebody, you know, to be able to say, okay, I want to fix this. You know, I think it's important to do that.
Excellent. And I know we got a question specifically about teachable moments. So I want to give kind of y'all a heads up. I'm getting ready to ask you about teachable moments. But what I really want to know about teachable moments is one of the great quotes that I really like that I hear in my work is, just because we are one doesn't mean we get it. So what I want you to do is to think of a teachable moment inside of your own community that you recently learned. Maybe it was a new term, maybe it was a new word, maybe it was you getting kind of challenged on an assumption that you were making. But within the LGBT community, because to Debbie's point, I think that's also good role modeling, is that just because we're in it and we get the pride package in the mail, spoiler alert, there's no pride package in the mail. But if we were to get some metaphorical pride package in the mail, that doesn't mean we understand everything. So that's your kind of heads up. While you are thinking, one of the questions that came in, and I'll try and answer this one and then see if you have anything to add on it too. But one of the questions that came in was, for those of us in the trans community, how do we push for better access to support and assist in securing our safety? A lot of our mainframe business offices are starkly conservative areas, which means finding safe places to work is becoming increasingly more problematic, even when we are afforded the opportunity to move to a different office. And so I wanted to kind of, one, make sure that I named that question, but I also want to say that in the consulting work that I do, what is a fascinating thing is when you are working in a place where you feel like you are automatically safe and you are entitled to feeling safe at work, it is important to kind of think about, and I usually recommend this as the first step of doing inclusion work, is I feel safe here. Who probably doesn't? Who maybe doesn't? Who is possible to be in this space that would not feel safe? And if you haven't walked yourself through that conversation yet, then you're not necessarily aware that other people may be having different experiences than you at work. So again, it kind of flips the conversation. For people who don't feel safe, and Julie used the term psychological safety, for those of that don't feel safe at work, sometimes it really is about, that's probably not going to happen. And you're going to have to figure out how to work in a space where you don't feel psychologically safe, or begin a job search process to a place where you could feel more psychologically safe. But at the same time, are you making this a problem and maybe it's actually not? Are you able to have a conversation with your coworkers, your supervisors, your managers in a way to see if this is something that you've created or it's real? And in the cases where it's real, there can be real internal recourse for when someone is not being inclusive. Sometimes that's a policy or procedure internally to the organization. Sometimes using some of the resources that Dan recommended, it's actually using best practices within the industry or outside of the industry. But how much of that are you willing to take on, especially if you do not feel safe at work? Taking that on is just going to make you feel potentially more unsafe. And so I recognize that that is not a direct answer, but I also want to know that any direct answer that would come up for that question was going to be really limited in scope. So depending on kind of where you fit within that question of not feeling safe at work, that's real. And sometimes the lack of safety is internally projected out, and sometimes it really is outward coming in. You just have to determine that within your space and then use the tools that you have available inside where you're currently working to allow yourself to feel safe or to make safer spaces. And sometimes you have to jump ship because it's not a safe place. And I think that's not a rose-colored unicorn font kind of statement, but there are places that are not safe. There are people who are not safe, and you just have to determine what kind of balance or how much you're willing to take on around that safety. So before we get to the teachable moments, what are you all thinking within your own organizations? I just gave kind of a complicated word cloud as well, talking about psychological safety at work. Is there anything that I left out specific to where you work or this industry that I don't know about because I'm a weird outsider? Debbie, you raised your finger.
I totally want to jump in, sorry.
Go for it, and then we'll do teachable moments when you're done.
Yeah, and I'll hold my teachable moment for that part. But in response to what you just said, something I think that's really, and I was hoping that people who are on listening with us today or on the replay will have some things they can go back to their companies and actually do, whether it's starting an ERG or other things. And one of those is non-gender restrooms, right? Like we haven't really touched on that in the workplace. There are people who are non-binary or trans, and you don't want to make them feel awkward walking into a bathroom where somebody's like, why are you in here? So I think non-gender bathrooms open up that, take that out of the equation. Every floor or somewhere in the building, there should be non-gender bathrooms where anybody can go in. I've worked in a workspace where, the stalls are completely private and it's shared sinks. So anybody can go in and you're washing your hands next to anybody, right? So it's doable, and if it's infrastructurally challenging, just make certain bathrooms on certain floors or part of the floors non-gender specific. So any family bathroom, whatever you want to call it, so that anybody can go in. So I think that's a really important one that people can think about. The other thing I've talked about, I was presenting to a bunch of CISOs last year, and I was talking about the fact that now that we're in this kind of sort of post-COVID scenario, a lot of companies have been giving up a lot of real estate. And so what they're doing is they're consolidating their spaces and they're creating these open formats, where people are sitting at desks right next to each other and they're not in cubicles anymore. There's no sense of privacy, which I think is cumbersome for anybody, frankly. But from a work environment. But if you have dysphoria, if you don't want to be out there all the time, I said it's really important to take that consideration that employees that you have just might need a space that's just more private. Like they don't need to be out there every day. And it was eye-opening, for these CISOs, because they were like, yeah, that just makes a lot of sense. Like they hadn't really thought about it. So sometimes people will make business decisions without really thinking through some of these things and how it impacts others. And it's important to be able to, somebody said earlier, have those avenues where people can give feedback, and that feedback can be seriously reviewed and actions can be taken upon. So just want to mention those couple of things in terms of the work environment itself, for any managers and executives and people in decision-making abilities listening, to think about those considerations.
Absolutely. There are kind of 8 variables that I recommend people looking at, and you named some that I think get overlooked a lot. When we're talking about culture or customs of an organization, the organizational style itself, who reports to who, how do you communicate to who, is that creating a safe environment for people to actually be able to express themselves, looking at those kind of power dynamics of communication. By mentioning bathrooms or private spaces, that's the actual artifacts within the actual structures or buildings or even virtual spaces that we've created, the language that we use, as well as kind of what is normed. Sometimes what we do is not written down. So what is normed versus what is an actual policy or something. And then how does that align with the beliefs and the values of the organization? So I think you brought up some really, really important points that I think will be valuable. So in the time that we have left, we have 4 minutes left. So I'm going to, you get to shorten your answers. Ha ha ha. So the teachable moments, what I'm going to ask you to do is name the subject or the name or the vocabulary, but like your short answers, the subject that you find yourself on a learning edge in reference to sexuality, gender, LGBTQIA plus population. So Dan, we'll start with you, and then Michelle, you're on deck. What's your teachable moment area?
I would say intersectionality. I think that George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement really exposed a lot of that. And there is discrimination within the LGBTQIA community. You know, as a cisgender white man, I recognize I have a lot of privilege that others don't. And that's something that I have been trying to recognize more myself and be better about supporting our brothers and sisters and non-binary siblings of color, because there are a lot of additional issues that they have to face that the rest of us don't.
Excellent. Great. Michelle, you're next, then Larry. Teachable moment area.
Teachable moment area. We use our ERG to talk about a lot of different things. And we, for example, presented about intersex and what that is. And I learned that it's as common as redheadedness. I think it's 1 in 4 people actually are intersex, and there's a spectrum there of that, right? So I think that it's important to teach, take advantage of those moments, and just there's so much to learn out there. So definitely use your ERGs to do that and make sure you're finding those intersectional compounded opportunities to include.
Excellent. Larry, your teachable moment area, and then Debbie, we'll tie it up at the end.
Great. I think I work in a very culturally diverse company and in a very culturally diverse office space. And the one thing that I need to learn more about is the culture and the backgrounds of the people that I work with that don't look like me, because everyone comes from a different environment and everybody. So, you know, and to understand what those, what either the religious beliefs or the backgrounds of those people will help me be a better colleague. And I have a long way to go with that.
Excellent. I couldn't agree more. Oh, great. And then Debbie, do you want to talk about what your teachable moment area is?
Yeah, it's in the subject of pronouns. So sometimes we get our pronouns wrong. And one of the trans individuals that I had on one of my educational calls really helped us to understand that if you get pronouns wrong, you know, inadvertently, like you fix it and move on. Like they don't want you making a big deal out of it, you know, like you could say sorry, but just like don't make they don't want you making a big deal out of it. So just fix it and move on. And so I learned that because, you know, I would say sorry because I really was, but like they don't want you making a big deal. So would be respectful, fix it, move on, and just try to just keep things going.
Excellent. And I would say for me, because I'll participate too, I'm always learning as well. Similar to Debbie, what you said is that when I do make a mistake, you know, I have heard and probably said, don't make a big deal of it. But I also don't know that what it is until it has been told to me. And then all of a sudden it's a big deal because I didn't even know that I did it, right? So I'm really sitting in, there are lots of things I will never know that I am actually doing, right? It's called unconscious behaviors. And occasionally you get handed a little present where someone tells you something that you did that you didn't know you did, and that it had a meaning or an impact that you didn't intend. So then being able to see it as a gift in those moments really helps me not say I'm sorry, but say, oh, thank you. And then I can go do my homework. And for me, that's about being grateful and applying gratitude to my own ignorance. So getting comfortable with my ignorance and then having gratitude for it called out for me. So I super appreciate that. We are at the top of the hour. Again, the texting number is 202-670-4262. We had another text that I think is a very funny thing that we might end on. And that is their favorite coming out comment to someone is, what's it like being straight? Wouldn't that be funny? I thought that would be a funny thing. So we'll do parting words. We'll go in reverse order. So Debbie, we'll start with you. If you had 5 words, and I'm giving you as much as I can to think about it, no hyphens, 5 words. What would you say is something that you are excited about generally in your life? 5 words ish.
my kids, supporting them, and making a better world for everybody.
Perfect. Hyphens worked. Okay, great. So we're going in reverse order. Larry, I believe you are next. 5-ish words. What are you excited about moving forward?
My condo in Puerto Vallarta.
And nailed it. 5 without hyphens. Good job. Okay, Michelle, what about you? 5 words-ish.
Family, home I am building. I have a house under construction, so yeah.
Oh, that is very exciting.
Family, home I am building.
Wonderful. And then Dan, 5 words-ish that you're excited about.
Summer and warm weather in Chicago.
Excellent. And I'm going to say I love doing queer webinars. Thank you very much for having a time with us. Again, feel free to text if you're watching the recording or not. 202-670-4262. Special thank you to Julie for kicking us off and supporting this webinar series, and to our amazing panelists, Dan, Debbie, Larry, Michelle, and everyone attending. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank everyone for your support here.